If you love a good two-piece swimsuit but feel more comfortable in a one-piece, New Look 6734 is an excellent merging of the two styles. The unique slant neckline and cutout at the waist give this pattern a one-of-a-kind style. I'm sewing this swimsuit today in a navy spandex lycra from Rex Fabrics, as well as a black Powermesh lining also from Rex Fabrics. I'm using special Swimsuit Elastic, and I'll link everything for you in the description below. I'll be sewing this project entirely using my regular sewing machine, using only 3 stitches, a lightning bolt stitch for all of the main seams, a 5mm stitch length for all of the basting, and a zigzag stitch with a length of 3 and a width of 3 for all of the top stitching. One note that I've reversed the positioning of the cutout and the neckline to be on the opposite sides of that of the pattern. Otherwise, I made no changes to the pattern, sewing a straight size 10. Let's sew this project from start to finish. Here we go. Place your top front and top back pieces right sides together and pin the side seam. Sew the side seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch, and then press that seam toward the back. And repeat for your lining pieces, placing these pieces right sides together and sewing that side seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. And we'll press that lining seam allowance toward the front. Now place the top, main, and lining right sides together. And we'll pin this bottom lower curve. Then we'll stitch this seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. And I'll start attaching my bodice elastic. I'm going to pin the elastic to the lining side of the bathing suit, matching the dot from my pattern piece with the side seam. And I want the inner edge of my elastic to line up perfectly with the seam. And with the elastic lined up perfectly with the seam as I sew, I'm going to sew a basting stitch right down the middle of the elastic, from one side to the other. Now we're going to understitch, sewing this elasticated seam to the lining only. I'm going to open the lining and the top piece away from each other and sew on the lining side with a wide zigzag stitch, catching the elastic as I go as I understitch that entire seam. And I'll be using about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now with my top and lining piece still opened out away from each other, I'm going to place each of them right sides together with themselves. And I'll pin the shoulder seam and the opposite side seam. And I'll repeat for the lining piece. Now I'll sew both of my shoulder seams and both of the side seams for the lining in the main piece with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. Now that we have our shoulder seams and both side seams sewn, we're going to turn this bodice piece right side out so that your lining will be on the inside. So here's what the bodice front now looks like with the main material on the outside and my lining underneath. And we're going to pin the lining and the main fabric all the way around for the front section, the armholes, and the lower section. As you pin, make sure that your seam allowances are going in opposite directions at each seam to reduce bulk. Now we're going to baste around that center section, around the armhole, and across this lower section. Use the longest stitch on your machine and about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Place your front and back bottom pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. And repeat for your front and back bottom lining pieces. Then sew each of these side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance using your stretch stitch. I'm going to turn my main bottom piece right side out and turn my bodice piece inside out. Then I'll slip my bodice piece over the bottom piece, making sure that the front top and bottom pieces are right side facing and the back top and bottom pieces are also right side facing. Then I'll align the dots from the pattern piece to pin the top and bottom together along that waistline. Now that that's pinned, I'll take the lining bottom piece and slip it over top this pinned piece so that the lining and the main bottom are right sides together with the bodice sandwiched in between. And then pin that waistline all the way around. Stitch all around the waistline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. I've cut my waist elastic piece according to the pattern piece, and I'm going to overlap the short ends by 5/8 of an inch. And then I'll zigzag back and forth to secure. The dots on your elastic pattern piece indicate the quarter points, and we're going to match those quarter points with those of the waist seam allowance, pinning in place so that the seam of your elastic ends up at one of the side seams. We're going to align the inner edge of the elastic with the stitching line that we just created and pin at the quarter points. Also note that as before, we're placing the elastic on the lining side of the bottom piece. Now we can sew the elastic along that waistband, making sure as we stitch that the inner edge of the elastic is still in line with the previous stitching line, and we're going to be basting once again using the longest stitch on your machine, stretching the elastic slightly from pin to pin. Open out your lining bottom piece and the main bottom piece away from each other, so that the bodice is also pulled away from the lining bottom. Then we're going to turn this elasticated seam down toward the lining. Once again, we're going to understitch, stitching from the front of the garment. So here I've turned the garment inside out so that once again I have full access to the bottom lining and all the other materials are pressed away from the waistline. And at my sewing machine, I'm going to sew the bottom lining to its seam allowance underneath with about a 1/4 inch seam allowance using a wide zigzag stitch all the way around the waistline. Now place your front and back bottom piece right sides together at the crotch seam and pin in place, repeating to pin the crotch seam of your lining pieces together. Sew both of those crotch seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and a stretch stitch. Now we can turn the garment right side out and baste the main and lining bottom pieces together around those leg openings. Baste these main and lining edges all the way around as we've done previously. Here is my neck elastic piece, and I'm going to lap the ends together just as we did for the waistline elastic. overlapping those short ends by 5/8 of an inch, then stitching back and forth to secure as we did previously. Here is my swimsuit inside out, and I'm going to place the elastic along the edges of the neck opening, matching the elastic seam with the side seam, and then matching the rest of the quarter points as indicated from the pattern pieces. Now we can baste the elastic to the neckline all the way around as we've done previously, using the longest stitch on your machine and just stitching right in the middle of that elastic. Now we can turn that elastic to the inside along the top of the elastic and pin all the way around. Now I'll use a medium zigzag stitch to sew that folded elastic to the inside, and I'll be using about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here's what that neckline will look like on the inside and zigzagged along the outside. Now we'll follow the exact same process to finish those armholes. I've gone ahead and prepared the elastic. We're going to baste it to the lining, turn the elastic to the inside, and top stitch with a zigzag stitch just as we did for the neckline. Now that the armhole is finished, we can complete the project by adding the leg hole elastics, once again in the same way as we did the 2 previous elastic applications. And once you're finished with those leg openings, your project is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Here is the finished swimsuit, and I love its uniqueness. It's a straightforward pattern with well-written instructions. Subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.